Please welcome Bryan to the S4 main stage.
Hello, S4 crowd, and we're at Kambana Day, so this should be fun this afternoon. And for this talk, I couldn't have asked for a better setup with the interview with Ed Schweitzer talking about let's keep things simple. I thought that theme came up over and over in that interview, and it was really brilliant to hear those perspectives. So what does that have to do with vendor questionnaires and cybersecurity? Well, this, as you might know, vendor questionnaires have kind of been like a holy grail pursuit, and there's that's a forward mention. You'll see it a little bit later, but the idea of more and more questions and hundreds of questions. I think on the highway day, one of the folks put a slide up about CSET. CSET out of the box, 347 questions. I forget how many hundreds of different categories that you go through, and it's just overwhelming. Now, what we're talking about today are specifically the questions for the vendors. So it's not a perfect match to CSET, don't get the wrong idea there. But what we are going to try and do is shrink things down. So the idea is pretty much this, is that these questionnaires are not really reducing risk. Certainly, they help with compliance risk, but not your actual ICS security risk. But what if they could? So that's the idea today. I hope I take you on a little bit of a journey, stretch your mind into new territory, because I think the questions that I'm going to throw up here aren't ones you've perhaps seen before. So to drill into why questionnaires aren't working, I couldn't find a better blog post than Daniel Mieser, IO Active thought leader. He has a beautiful blog I encourage all of you to read, but he basically says, hey, these questionnaires are pure security theater. And unfortunately, this is what the industry is relying on. I was talking to some of you before the presentation, and it's natural, right? Supply chain rules are coming into force in NERC-CIP. Let's take this program we have for our IT department and just use those same questionnaires. We'll send them out to all of our OT vendors, and voila, we've got a compliance answer. But these things really aren't drilling into the problem. What Daniel explains so well in his blog is that even audit programs where you send people to companies and have them look all through their systems to see how they're kind of running their IT, you won't find the dead bodies. It really takes much deeper inspection to find that thing. The kind of things that Jason Larson does and the rest of IO Active, right? You really need to dig in. But it's just a full fantasy that you could approach that with a security questionnaire. So there's the first perspective, a company that does a lot of assessments, a lot of experience saying, hey, if you really want to find these dead bodies, questionnaires aren't your answer. Let's find another data point, set things up. This one is from Marianne Davidson, Oracle's CSO, presented at RSA a few years ago. And her talk was a spoof on Monty Python's Holy Grail. But I would encourage any of you to also watch this. It's still posted on RSA video. But what really stood out in her assessment is that specifically as a big company like Oracle, you can see the circles don't overlap really well, right? You get a questionnaire that tries to ask about an entire company the size of Oracle, and it just doesn't apply to the product or specific service from Oracle that might be being used by your company. So we have to be careful with these questions and scoping them right so that they can even be answered, and so that they're applicable, right? So that was Marianne's advice. And at the end of her presentation, she has some really wonderful tips, pro tips on how to see if we can move some of this to self-service. Like vendors should really start putting information, FAQs, up online, so these questionnaires become kind of done by themselves. All right, so there's a security company, a vendor. Let's get a blogger, famous blogger in the electric sector, Tom Ulrich. Blogger extraordinaire, I think some people like to call him. But if you're not convinced with the first two arguments, he said, hey, look at the money. You too can waste a lot of money on security questionnaires. And when you look through what Tom's analysis does is each and every point, especially when questionnaires move from just a due diligence exercise, but closer and closer toward contractual language and actual requirements, you will find each one of those points becomes subject to negotiation with perhaps highly paid lawyers and other people involved to negotiate down to the final point. And when you run the math, it's a disaster from a cost point of view. So Tom's blogging style is wonderful to read. His humor is kind of like engineer humor, so I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So there we go. Let's not waste time and money and resources on things that aren't really helping. Kind of Dale's mini keynote message, right? It's the space we're working in is too important to not do the right things. So Director Krebs said supply chain is in the top 4. It's a big priority. So what can we do? So if no one's got the resources to do all this supply chain risk management, it's kind of like the patching discussion earlier. Can't patch all the vulnerabilities. There's not enough time and money to do that. How do we boil this down? So the idea we're putting forward is let's focus the questions very specifically. Instead of trying to go broad, don't try to assess the entire security culture of a company, but look exactly if it's a product, focus in on that product. And take advantage of what's online. There's a lot of online security assessment information that can reduce a lot of friction. You can even, some people have services, right? The credit rating services, well, there's security scorecard and BitSide and other services that can, in a snap of fingers, give you a good assessment of where a company is. So take advantage of that. But don't forget, let's be fit for purpose with these questionnaires. Don't try to make them fit into something you really can't do with a questionnaire. You're going to have to rely on other mechanisms. Testing, for instance, is never going to go away. So, what's the approach to zero in? Well, let's use our impact categories. I really like that proposal Art had. Let's narrow things down by, is it a safety impact or not? What about loss of control, manipulation of control? That's a different category. And then view. Those 3 areas are how I'm proposing we put these questions together. So if you're procuring something that has to do with safety, let's look at that one first. And safety, some of you probably have more experience than I did, so I cheated on this one. I went to the Project Logic report on safety instrumented systems. This was reissued just last year, and some really nice work after Trisis. And cool thing about Logic is they publish a public report. Now, some of you in oil and gas are members, you can get the nitty-gritty stuff, but there was actually a section, recommendations for the vendors. And the 3 there are maybe not what you would have otherwise asked. Do you really ask your vendors to go work with the operating system people to, prune things down, make sure the operating system's good? Well, that's a pretty insightful thing, especially with Urgent 11, right? It's really important that your vendors are working with the operating system platform that they choose. Now, the piece that wasn't, at least in the public report, and I've added on here, courtesy of research from S4 a few years ago, but after Triton, this lock functionality on these safety devices is worthy of a question. So I boiled the safety category down to just these 4 questions. Let's keep it simple, see how it goes. So now some of you, I invite you to question me when we go to the Cabana sessions or at Beer ISAC. We can argue about this, but man, I think it's progress. Getting down to 4 questions out of 300 thousands of questions, that's progress. So what about the next one? What about control? Let's take a look at the control category. And this one was the most challenging. I was not sure it was going to be possible to simplify control impacts into a simple set of questions. So I tested with benchmarks from NIST, ISA, IEC 62443, and Microsoft Research, surprisingly enough. So, and when you look at those benchmarks, hey, those are reasonable numbers. There's 7 foundational requirements in NIST. There's 6 in the core baseline, 7 properties of secure devices. So, yeah, I think we can probably find some questions that match up with that. But I wanted, like these standards, how well aligned are they? So I did a little exercise, spaghetti diagram. I was talking to Darren Heifel, one of the authors of the original spaghetti diagram for Smart Grid, but this is nothing compared to that. But what I found is the overlap is quite good between these benchmarks. And the amazing thing about 62443 is it created its concepts, its foundations, maybe a decade or more ago. The NIST and the Microsoft thing is just a couple years ago, so I'm really impressed with how well that has stood up and how good of a job the engineers in ISA had done on those concepts. So, this is probably an eye chart up there, but the point is that there is good alignment between these standards. They call different things different categories, if you will. But I centered on the NIST and just kind of built out around it. The only 2 that didn't have overlap, I'll just spend a second on this, is the Microsoft research folks believed that within a device, you need some ability to do compartmentalization, and you need to really have a small trusted computing base. And I thought those are really insightful, but they haven't mapped back up to the other standards yet, so I didn't include any questions related to that. So with no further ado, let's take a look at what I'm proposing for control impact questions. So the first 5, I'm not going to read all the questions, but I have to honor the IO active perspective here and say the number 1 question is I ask about the verification testing, right? And that's in the 62443 standards as well. There's still good alignment with my baselines, so I think that deserves to be the number 1. And one of our ideas is, wouldn't it be great if we could vote in the audience and maybe adjust just these priorities? But I did try to put them in a priority. Everyone knows you need to have device identity. It came up in the highway session. It's the core for being able to do these asset management systems and so on. So again, another great question to ask. And you can kind of go down the list here. I suppose the one about communication integrity is the one that I feel almost a little disingenuous. Here we are, it's 2020, and we're still pushing systems that are talking Modbus, right? This is not good. DNP3, the same thing. So number 5, this communication integrity is an issue for our industry. I think it deserves to be in the questionnaires. I think you'll get some answers here that says, no, we're still doing the old stuff. So when these questionnaires go out, don't always expect perfection. Expect honest answers, and then you can move forward with how you decide to prioritize your risk and manage your risk. I promised 10 questions on this, and I did use all 10. Probably could have gone a lot farther. Let's take a look at the second set of 5. Software integrity. This is a big one for me. Some of you, I hope you go see the Adolis Cabana this afternoon, but I really like what is going on with Adolis. And as a community, if we can really get our hands around software integrity, we can eradicate malware from ICS systems. We have to really put a focus on this, but we can do it. We can have a master whitelist of the known proper software, the authentic software. Defense in depth. Anyone surprised that that made the list? You shouldn't be. It was like a core part of what the ranking system for patching and not patching was. If your exposure is so low, you can defer patching. It's valuable to know about defense in depth. And the idea that there's no single point of failure in your security model is super valuable to know about. Maybe one more I'll throw out there is number 9, the event logging. So wouldn't it be great if you knew that your logs were being moved off the control device, that they weren't tamperable because you've got separate copies, right? I think it's a great question. How do you get those logs off that device? There's other details. I won't read all the questions, but I think you'll find that they borrowed heavily from 62443 standards, and I threw in a few extras. There'll be a talk about software bill of materials, I think, tomorrow. So I won't belabor that one, but also a big believer in that concept. You have to know what's inside, at least ask, right? Did the libraries come from some banned company? Starts with an H. So you have to know these things. Right. So we've done safety, done control. View was a tough one for me. And I almost decided that we would have to punt on that. Oh, I'm not to view yet. Yeah. There's another category of vendor, the remote service vendors. And I thought the questions here, I didn't really even need 10 questions here. I thought we could handle this one with fewer, but it's modeled after the Ukraine scenario. So take the lessons learned from Ukraine. Let's apply those to vendor questionnaire. So here's what it looks like. The 7 questions, MFA, no surprise, right? You definitely want that in there. Like a lot of people, I also believe that the connections for remote access need to originate from the operating company. Having always on open inbound is just really asking for it. You know, did you hear the way Ed described how they did it in the old days? That was great, right? Call up the operator, get them to turn it on from the inside. That's great stuff. Why do we have to give that up so soon? We shouldn't. The one that saves our bacon a lot is having an audit trail after a session. Doesn't happen often, but once, twice a year, you get that phone call after service session, you guys messed up our system. It's got a virus on it now. You know, we think you did it. If you don't have that audit trail as a vendor, if you don't have that audit trail as an operator, you don't know. And it's just, you can just tell what a nightmare scenario it is. It's so much better to say, oh, you know what? Here it is. We see it in the drop-down. That was already on the system when we got there. So have that audit trail. So I won't read through all those. I will try to describe the little picture here a little bit. We divide our remote access into different kind of use cases. So be sure you're talking to apples and apples. Most people do understand this idea that you want to go through some kind of intermediate device. That's even the law of the land for power companies. But remote access sometimes could be a WebEx. It sometimes could be a peer-to-peer thing like Skype connections. These happen in businesses all the time. So be sure you're clear about what requirements apply to what kind of remote access. And then ban that layer 2 VPN stuff. Man, it just drives me nuts when I see that. All right. Now the view. The view stuff was tough. And I almost gave up on it. I almost said, hey, you just don't even try to answer that one. Loss of view happens all the time for lots of different reasons. Asking questions about it at first didn't make sense to me, but I tried to do my due diligence, and I said, holy crap, okay, so Project Robust, yeah, they took down loss of view in a lot of cases. There was just the first known attack on the power grid. It was took down the firewalls on a wide area network. There's been some awesome research, even going after ISA 100 mesh networks. The wireless things are just getting hammered at this. I think it was Blake Johnson was up here just a few years ago talking about the Brodsky attack on wireless networks, right? So run into Jake, you can ask him what the Brodsky attack is. And even before that, we had the positive technology guys talking about HART going from 4 to 20 all the way up to like an SAP system. It was pretty amazing. And then, of course, our own Jason Larson and his triangles. You know, can you actually hide view affecting things inside a pressure meter? So, okay, you get the idea. So we can mess with view. We should try to come up with some questions. And I will say this is the most uncertain part of the presentation, but this is what I came up with. And you won't find these in IT questionnaires. But the first one is, hey, is there an unauthenticated command that just shuts off the flow, right? That's the Modbus unsolicited shutdown thing. You don't want that. Detecting loss of input. So how do you know? How do you know if you're not getting inputs anymore? It seems like a reasonable question to ask. And then the whole 737 MAX thing is in my head. A lot of us have been reading about it, but redundant sensors, how do you resolve them? I mean, it seems like they should have done better. I really feel for that tragedy, but boy, those jets had redundant sensors and those guys were just stuck with using just one. It's horrible. The rest of the questions are similarly themed. You know, are you really checking the data before you go use it, before you do anything with it on the screens? And the last one is a shout out to Michael Tucker and the work he's done. And I think others have done some work, but don't forget your calibrators also have impact on view. And you should maybe ask some questions about your calibrators if that's in scope of the supplier. So those are the questions I came up with. Again, intentionally focused on our world, the ICS world. I'm not trying to reproduce what gets done in IT. There's plenty of questionnaires for the IT stuff, but we don't have stuff for ICS. So that's what I'm shooting for here. So we're on the home stretch. Those were the main categories. I gave you more than 10 questions, but you see I did it. Narrowed it down into very specific things. So the final idea is fit for purpose. Keep those questions tight to what actually is of interest to you, the most important thing. Try to focus the questions on things that will save you money, that will lower the cost for you to defend whatever it is the vendor is supplying. And know what your red flags are. Know what your red flags are. Those can really help a lot in making the questionnaires quick, simple, and to the point. Some other just general do's and don'ts. And I could have gone crazy with this, but you know, don't do legal terms in these questionnaires. I cannot believe how many of them I get that really you basically, as a technical responder, the only thing you can say is, well, you know, that's in the contract. Sorry, we can't really even answer that in this kind of a questionnaire. So kind of keep the security questionnaires for vendors, keep them in their lanes. If these are due diligence, it's one thing. If it's contractual, that's really not a questionnaire, it's a negotiation, right? For vendors, do what Marianne Davidson suggests. Let's get this information up in FAQs. Let's get it published. Let's be more transparent about what's in our software. Let's make it so you don't have to try to go send people on wild goose chases to find the answers to these questions. Another common problem is once you operate at scale, a lot of you are very large companies, you have to kind of outsource who is managing the orchestration of these questionnaires. And once you get that middleman in the middle, the vendor gets a questionnaire. I've been at this end, and I go, what do they mean? And the person you have to talk to doesn't even understand the question. So be very cautious about these back and forths. It's kind of a red flag that something's wrong with your questionnaire. And doesn't really go for saying, but to repeat Daniel Miesler's thing, don't fall for just BS. Don't ask people, are you an axe murderer? They're going to say no. So there's dead bodies buried out there. Don't expect you're going to get those kind of answers in the questionnaires. So that's what I had prepared for you today. I hope you found it at least a little curious. I urge you to come and debate me, tell me where I'm wrong. But as skated diva, last right, I'm always right. So here we go. No questionnaire will tell you if there's a back error in the software. So please test. Use tools. Save the questionnaires for what they're good for. Thank you so much.